The noose wobbled in the freight yard as dusk burned the prairie copper, and Silas Mercer tasted dust and iron, while two townsmen shoved his shoulders toward the crate they meant for a step. Horace Pike, the storekeeper who had purchased a bride with letters full of lies, stood red-faced and righteous, waving a folded contract and shouting that law was on his side. The woman in the travel dress, Mara Finch, cheeks welted from the platform, kept her chin level, though a rope still bit red around her wrist where Pike had tied her for stumbling. Sheriff Calder Boone watched the street rather than the knot, pretending order lived here. But everyone felt the air tilt when a thin column of riders crested the southern rise. They came without hurry, dust flowing around their ponies like creek water, and even the talkative men stopped talking. At the front rode Chief Gray Eagle, hair streaked with winter, gaze steady as a plumb line. Beside him, tucked small in a borrowed coat, sat little Bear Toka, his right hand wrapped thick, the bandage browned where a storehouse door had closed on it last week. Pike called it discipline. The Lakota called it harm. Gray Eagle dismounted without flourish and looked first at the noose, then at Mara's wrist, then at Silas's bruised mouth. He spoke in measured English that carried farther than shouting. "Who tied this rope?" he asked. "And who cut that one?" Pike barked that Silas had interfered with a lawful marriage, and several men nodded with the relief of men who want rules to be simple. Silas answered that people were not property, that a promise could not be hammered out of fear, and that a man raised to the sound of prayer should not flinch at mercy. Gray Eagle weighed him with the calm of a man, reading weather against old memory. He turned to Sheriff Boone and said the town's knot would not decide the day. Then he set the weight of his voice like a stone. "Take the man." Hands dragged Silas from the crate. The noose swung like a question mark, hunting its sentence. Mara moved before her fear could dress itself, stepping between rope and throat with a steadiness that startled even her. "If he dies," she said, "I go with him." The yard held its breath in one long, low hush, while the riders closed their circle and the evening light sharpened shadows into edges. Gray Eagle's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with a craftsman's attention, and he said the camp would eat before it judged. The knot would wait for the fire. And if mercy had a voice tonight, it would have to speak quickly. The ride to the Lakota camp stretched across a land so wide it could swallow sins whole. And Silas Mercer kept his wrists bound because pride still outranked pain in the order of things, while the riders around him moved with the soundless rhythm of dust. Mara Finch rode beside him on a borrowed mare, her veil torn, her throat stiff from speaking against a town that believed silence was virtue. And every hoofbeat seemed to hammer the same thought: that a single choice made in anger had turned her from property into witness. Chief Gray Eagle rode ahead, his face unreadable, remembering a different rope from years before, when a young warrior had been hanged outside Fort Benton for stealing bread that had once been theirs. He had sworn then that judgment would never again wear another man's face. The camp waited in a low valley of cottonwoods, smoke curling like memory through the branches, women tending fires, children stopping their play to stare at the pale strangers. Grandmother Wanya met them with a look that could measure hearts faster than words, and she gestured toward a place near the council fire where they might sit. The air smelled of juniper and broth. It smelled like forgiveness, learning to breathe. Silas watched the small boy, little Bear Toka, cradle his injured hand against his chest, the wood splint held by twine and patience. And something old in him shifted because once, long ago, his own father's hand had crushed under a wagon wheel and no neighbor had come. He asked the elder if he might help, and when she nodded, he rinsed the wound in warm water and bound it again with a torn strip of his own shirt. The boy blinked, and the quiet between them filled with something more solid than speech. Gray Eagle observed, eyes narrowed against the firelight, and asked, in the tone of a man testing truth, why Silas had interfered with another man's claim. Silas answered that a woman is not a deed to be filed, that a promise is only real when both voices can finish the sentence. The chief's mouth curved like a scar softening. Mara felt that line carve itself somewhere she hadn't known could ache. The elder passed them a round of bread dark with grain, broke it in 3 pieces, and set them in their palms as though she were sealing an oath older than language. Gray Eagle said the council would judge at dawn, but for tonight the rope would rest. Mara whispered thanks that almost sounded like prayer, and Silas, staring into the flames, remembered a home long gone, and a mercy he hadn't thought would find him again. Dawn arrived pale and cold, washing the valley in silver light that caught on the smoke from the breakfast fires, and Silas Mercer woke to the sound of drums soft as heartbeats, the kind that measure time by feeling rather than by clock. He had slept on the edge of camp with a guard near but not hostile, his hands now free though his future wasn't, and the taste of last night's ash still clung to his mouth. Across the clearing, Mara Finch helped a woman grind corn, her sleeves rolled, her hair unbraided, and when she laughed at something said too fast in Lakota, it sounded like a door cracking open in a long-abandoned house. Chief Gray Eagle stood by the council circle with his staff planted in the dirt, the carved feathers along its length catching the sun. Around him gathered men and women of different ages, their expressions a mix of curiosity and weariness. For the line between justice and revenge had always been thin as a thread. Gray Eagle began speaking in his language, his words steady and deliberate. And when he shifted to English for the strangers, he said that the rope from the town was not the first rope to have crossed this prairie, and each one carried the memory of hands, some innocent, some not. He asked Silas what law he followed, and Silas said he followed the law that begins before courts and ends after graves, that a man's worth is measured by what he protects. The chief nodded once and turned to Mara, asking if she had chosen the man who'd written her name on a contract. She shook her head, her voice quiet but firm, as she told them how the storekeeper had promised safety, then traded it for control. Grandmother Wania stepped forward with a bowl of water and poured it slowly onto the ground, saying every untruth should be washed clean before judgment. The water hissed against the ash, made a sound like breathing. Then the boy, little bear Toka, stepped up shyly and lifted his bandaged hand for the chief to see, saying that the man Silas saved had given him bread and new cloth, not pain. The camp murmured. Old women nodded. Gray Eagle said the council would hear one more truth before sunset and sent runners toward the town to fetch Horace Pike. Silas's stomach tightened. Mara looked toward him, and for the first time, neither owed the other a debt. Between them, trust had begun to feel less like an accident and more like a direction. Above them, the sun broke fully through, scattering light across the valley like a promise trying to remember its name. By late afternoon, the riders sent to town had not returned, and the valley sat beneath a sky turning the color of steel shavings while the council prepared its fire for evening judgment. Each log laid like a promise of truth. Silas Mercer helped gather wood, though no one had asked him. He worked because stillness made him think too much. Mara Finch knelt beside Grandmother Wania, learning to shape dough between her palms, and the elders smiled at her clumsy hands before setting the loaves near the flame. Gray Eagle stood apart, watching the horizon for dust that might announce Horace Pike's approach, and the weight of leadership pressed through his posture like an old wound. When the bread began to rise, Wania broke a small piece and handed it to Silas with a nod, telling him through gesture alone that peace begins with hunger shared. He took it, offered the next piece to the boy Little Bear, and something wordless passed among them, an exchange neither bound by language nor limited by tribe. Mara watched, her heart tightening because kindness could still appear in a place built for reckoning. Then distant hoofbeats echoed across the ridge, and soon the runners returned with Pike, his wrists tied now, his eyes narrow with fury. The council gathered around the fire as the sun dropped behind the buttes. Gray Eagle faced both men, his staff marking the boundary between them. He asked Pike if he had struck the woman, and the man spat, calling it correction. He asked if he had crushed the child's hand, and the man said the thief deserved it. A murmur of disgust rippled through the circle. Gray Eagle then asked Silas if he had drawn his knife for pride, and Silas shook his head, saying he had drawn it because God was too slow that day. The elder woman laid the baked bread upon a cloth, breaking it in half, one side for each man, and said, "Whoever breaks his peace with anger proves guilt without trial." Pike snatched his portion and flung it into the dirt. Silas held his quietly, then offered half to the boy. Gray Eagle's jaw tightened. He declared the storekeeper's word broken and his claim void. But tradition demanded balance, so the rope of judgment still waited. Mara stepped forward then, saying if blood was owed, she would share it, for mercy cannot live alone. The fire cracked. The night leaned closer. Somewhere behind them, thunder grumbled like an unspoken verdict as the first cold drops of rain began to fall across the bread. The rain sharpened into needles by dusk, flattening the fires until the camp glowed in pockets of gold and shadow. And Chief Gray Eagle ordered the people into the council shelter where smoke rose through a hole in the roof like breath escaping a prayer. Silas Mercer stood in the center, soaked, rope again around his wrists, though this time more for form than fear. Mara Finch sat against a post, her hair darkened by wet, the hem of her skirt streaked with red mud, and every heartbeat sounded like a drum, reminding her she had chosen this place, these strangers, and the man about to be judged. Gray Eagle lifted his hand for silence, his eyes resting on Pike, who trembled less from cold than from the awareness that the same rope once meant for another now waited for him. The chief spoke slowly, his English clean and deliberate. A storm decides who hides and who endures, and tonight the storm would know their names. He asked the crowd if any saw mercy and anger, and no voice answered. Then he turned to Silas and said, "A warrior is not measured by the enemies he makes, but by the hands he refuses to harm." Silas bowed his head, saying he wished to harm no one again, that the rope could hang empty and he would still feel its weight. The word stirred something in Gray Eagle, who remembered his own son, lost to soldiers, and how revenge had once seemed like air, until it poisoned him. The thunder cracked above, and little Bear Toka cried out as the sound tore the night. But Mara knelt beside him, drawing the boy against her chest, whispering that storms pass faster when someone listens. The chief watched her and said the woman carried courage in a quieter form than war drums. Pike cursed them all, saying he would see their camp burned, and lunged forward before anyone moved. Silas stepped between him and the child without thought, taking the blow that followed. Pike's fist split his lip. The second strike caught his shoulder. But the third never landed, because Gray Eagle's staff blocked it mid-swing. The chief's voice thundered louder than the storm. No man owns another's body or soul. He tore the rope from Silas's wrists, threw it into the mud, and declared the judgment met. The rope condemned itself. Rain hissed around them, lightning flared, and for one fragile instant, the storm and the firelight braided together like mercy and wrath, learning to share the same sky. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving behind a prairie glazed with silver dew, and a silence so wide it seemed the world had been rinsed of voices. But inside that stillness, trouble began to gather again, like smoke finding its way through the cracks of a roof. Silas Mercer sat near the cold ashes of last night's fire, his lip crusted, shoulders sore, and though his hands were free, his heart felt as bound as before, because peace had come too quickly, and quick peace never lasts. Mara Finch walked the edge of the camp carrying a bowl of water for Grandmother Wanya, trying to ignore the stares from two young warriors who whispered that mercy was weakness. Across the clearing, Chief Gray Eagle spoke low with his counsel. The boy Little Bear chased a puppy near the riverbank, his laughter small and clean against the morning air. When the riders sent to scout the town returned, dust-cloaked and grim. They brought a warning that men from the settlement were gathering with rifles, calling it justice for an abduction. The words fell into the camp like sparks on dry grass. Gray Eagle ordered the women and children to prepare for movement. But his nephew Hawkstone, young and restless, argued that no tribe should bend again before pale law. Silas heard the rising anger and stepped forward, saying blood would only buy more blood. But the youth spat that a white man's warning was worth less than the rope he'd cut. For a moment, everything stopped. The air, the wind, even the birds. And Mara's voice slipped between them, trembling but steady, saying that courage without mercy was just another kind of cruelty. Hawkstone glared, yet lowered his spear. Still, the seed of conflict had been planted. Gray Eagle placed his hand on Silas's shoulder, the same wounded one, and said the storm may have ended above, but not within. If the townsmen came, the council would defend its people. Silas answered he would stand with them, and the chief nodded once, perhaps out of respect or pity. As the sun climbed, a shout rose from the northern trail. Riders, maybe a dozen, armed. Panic rippled through the camp. Mara gathered the boy and the elder toward a shelter, while Silas fetched the rifle he'd surrendered days ago, knowing the line between protector and prisoner had vanished. The wind picked up again, carrying the dry taste of dust and gunpowder. Somewhere a hawk cried above the ridge, circling the valley like an omen that could not choose a side. The first shot cracked across the valley, just as the sun broke free of the ridge. A sharp sound that scattered birds and breath alike. And in that single echo, every decision left unmade found its answer. Silas Mercer dropped to one knee beside the wagon they had pulled near the riverbank, checking the chamber of his rifle, his shoulders screaming each time he moved it. Mara Finch crouched behind the wheel with Little Bear and Grandmother Wanya, whispering prayers she'd never learned properly, the syllables trembling like the wind through cottonwood leaves. Chief Gray Eagle shouted orders in Lakota, sending half his men to flank the slope while the rest held the shallow bank. And for the first time since the fever that took his son, the old leader felt his pulse beat with something fiercer than grief. The attackers rode in hard from the north, a tangle of townsmen and drifters drunk on righteousness, Horace Pike among them, shouting that the savages had stolen his wife. Bullets struck a water, throwing up sprays of mud and light. Silas waited until the horses hit the creek's edge, then fired once, hitting the ground near Pike's mount to scatter rather than kill. But the storekeeper fired back wild, grazing Silas's arm. Mara saw the blood bloom through his sleeve and almost rose. But Wanya caught her wrist, whispering that sometimes saving a man means letting him stand alone. The boy clutched the elder's hand, wide-eyed yet silent, learning the shape of courage without being told its name. Gray Eagle moved through smoke and shouting like a ghost carved from thunder. His staff raised not to strike, but to signal. And slowly the attackers faltered under the precision of defenders who fought for home rather than hate. Pike's horse panicked and threw him. He landed in the shallows, gasping, his gun lost. Silas crossed the creek, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him upright, the rifle leveled but the trigger untouched. Around them, the firing dwindled to scattered echoes. The chief approached, face streaked with ash, and looked from Silas to the man shaking in his grip. "What will your law choose now?" he asked. Silas breathed hard and said the law of mercy, though it burned worse than the wound. He let Pike fall to his knees. The wind carried the smell of smoke from a burning wagon. Somewhere behind them, Mara's voice called his name once, steady, certain, as if it might hold the whole valley together. The sky bruised purple by evening, and the smoke from burned wagons coiled into the dimming light like memory refusing to fade, while the creek carried its reflection away in thin silver ribbons. Silas Mercer stood near the riverbank, where the last gun had gone silent. Blood dried dark on his sleeve, his breath thick with the smell of powder and rain-soaked earth. Horace Pike knelt a few yards off, wrists bound now with the same rope once meant for Silas, his head lowered under the weight of choices finally catching up. Chief Gray Eagle faced the circle of his people, his staff planted firm, his voice hoarse from command yet steady with purpose. He said the storm had come and passed, and what remained was the part only hearts could finish. Around him, the tribe listened. Mara Finch stood beside the elder and the child, one hand resting lightly on Little Bear's shoulder, the other gripping her torn sleeve as though to keep from shaking. Gray Eagle turned to Silas and asked what he would have done if the shot had been his, alone to call. Silas answered he would have fired once, to scare, not to kill, because killing ends truth faster than it ends war. The chief nodded and said, "Mercy is harder to carry than steel, but those who do become stronger than both." He raised his staff toward Pike, declaring that no blood debt remained. The rope had taken enough. The man screamed that they were all damned fools, that kindness would bury them. Gray Eagle said perhaps, but better buried by mercy than crowned by cruelty. Mara stepped forward then, holding out the coat Silas had lost earlier to the mud and rain, and placed it around his shoulders, whispering that some protection can't be stolen once it's given. He met her eyes and saw no fear left there, only the calm of someone who has already survived the worst and still chosen gentleness. The chief lifted his hand, and the people answered with quiet, not cheers, for peace rarely shouts its own name. The evening wind swept through, carrying sparks from the rekindled fire across the darkening plain, and those sparks drifted upward like tiny prayers unspoken yet heard. Silas looked to the horizon and thought that if grace had a color, it might look exactly like the sky right now. Red fading to gold, smoke fading to silence. Morning broke soft and gold across the prairie, mist clinging low over the ashes of the campfires. And for the first time in many days, no one woke to shouting. Silas Mercer rose from the ground near the riverbank, his shoulders stiff but healing, the borrowed coat draped around him like proof that warmth could come from unexpected hands. Chief Gray Eagle walked the perimeter of the camp, checking the wounded and speaking quietly to each, his voice a thread stitching peace back into torn cloth. The air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke, the scent of something trying to begin again. Mara Finch fetched water from the creek, with Little Bear following close, the boy's bandaged hand now clean and nearly mended. When she knelt to fill the pail, she caught her reflection trembling in the water and hardly recognized the woman who had stepped off the train days ago. Grandmother Wanya joined her, saying softly that storms carve their own kind of beauty if you live long enough to see it. Mara smiled faintly, asking if forgiveness truly healed what violence breaks. The elder said forgiveness doesn't heal the wound. It teaches you to walk without reopening it. Across the clearing, Pike sat apart, unbound but watched, staring at the horizon with eyes empty of fight. He would be escorted back to town under truce. Silas approached Gray Eagle and asked what debt he still owed. The chief replied none, only the memory of a choice made right. Then he handed Silas a small carving, a sliver of wood shaped roughly like a feather, saying it bore the Lakota word wust, goodness. So he would remember the difference between strength and cruelty. The wind lifted as if in agreement. Mara stepped to Silas's side, her dress still torn, yet her eyes clear, and asked what he would do next. He said he might build fences that didn't divide land, but kept the wind from stealing the fire. She laughed quietly, the sound warming the cool air. Together they helped the others gather what the night had scattered. When the sun climbed high enough to burn away the mist, Gray Eagle raised his hand in farewell, and the tribe began to move east toward their hunting grounds, leaving footprints that glistened briefly before the wind erased them. Silas watched them go, the carved feather tight in his palm, and felt the strange weight of peace settling exactly where anger used to live. By nightfall, the valley had emptied of noise. Only the whisper of wind moving through the reeds beside the river and the faint crackle of the last fire holding back the dark. Silas Mercer sat close to its warmth, the carved feather resting in his palm, tracing the smooth grain as if it contained every lesson the past week had tried to teach him. Mara Finch knelt beside the flame, feeding it twigs that glowed brief and bright before turning to ember, her face lit in shifting gold. The boy Little Bear slept curled beneath the elder's shawl, his healed hand resting open, unguarded, while grandmother Wanya murmured a song that sounded older than the stars. Chief Gray Eagle stood at the edge of the camp, watching the horizon where distant lightning pulsed silently beyond the hills. And he felt something he had not known in many winters: contentment without victory. He said quietly that the land forgets faster than men do, but sometimes the heart must keep a scar to remember where mercy began. Silas rose and walked to him, handing back the staff he had used as a crutch during the battle. The chief accepted it with a slow nod, saying a man who can hold his anger without letting it spill is worth more than 10 who can shoot straight. Mara joined them, the hem of her dress brushing the dew, her eyes reflecting the fire's last light. She told Gray Eagle she would stay through the harvest to help rebuild the burned wagons. And the old man smiled, saying the prairie had room for anyone who carried peace in their hands. When she turned to Silas, he asked where her road would go after that. And she said wherever the wind led, so long as it wasn't back to fear. He smiled at that, feeling the ache in his shoulder ease as if the words themselves were medicine. They returned to the fire, sitting close but not touching, watching the sparks lift into the dark like souls finding their way home. The elder's song faded. The boy sighed in his sleep. The fire sank to coals. Mara whispered that mercy is the truest law of the West, and Silas answered that he hoped the land remembered it. Above them the stars stretched wide and clear, endless and patient. And when the last ember winked out, the valley did not fall into silence. It fell into peace. If stories of kindness, courage, and redemption speak to you, the narrator's voice concluded softly, another waits just beyond the next horizon.